Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, on to today's topic. This is price elasticity of supply, our fourth and final installment in this elasticity unit. I'm not looking at demand this time, obviously looking at supply. Now we now remember the law of supply from our supply topic.
The law of supply is one of the most fundamental principles in microeconomics. According to the law of supply, for all other things remaining constant, the higher the price of a good or service, the higher the supply. Producers want to produce more of that good or service at the higher price to increase profits. Conversely, the lower the price, the lower the supply. If you were to graph this relationship with the quantity supplied on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis, the relationship between price and supply is graphed as an upward sloping curve from left to right. This line is referred to as a supply curve. Movement along the supply curve is referred to as supply expanding or contracting as price changes. Wesleya Corp produces electric cars. At a price of $20,000, Wesleya produces 5,000 cars. If the price increases to $25,000, Wesleya will produce 6,000 electric cars. The higher price induces them to build more cars. The law of supply is a theoretical concept. In real life, variables do not remain constant. Things other than price can affect supply, such as prices of related goods, availability, and price of raw materials.
Okay, so the law of supply, as the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied will increase, and vice versa. So elasticity of supply is looking at how much a price change will influence the quantity supplied. How responsive is quantity supplied to changes in price? So price elasticity of supply, PES, measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied to a change in price. Now, it's necessary for a firm to know how quickly and effectively it can respond to changing market conditions, especially to price changes. Right, we know there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied because that's what the law of supply states. As prices increase, quantity supplied increases. As prices decrease, quantity supplied decreases. PES, price elasticity of supply, provides useful information as to how much that quantity supplied of a good will change in response to a change in price. Now, for some goods and services, a small price change can result in a relatively large change in the quantity supplied of a good. We call this elastic supply. Relatively large changes, elastic supply. Relatively large changes in quantity supplied, elastic supply. And for other goods and services, a relatively large price will not change the quantity supplied by that much. So when the quantity supplied doesn't change that much in response to a price change, we call this inelastic supply. Just like demand, price elasticity of supply is measured along the slope of the supply curve. Right, so we can have a look at the effect of a price increase here from P1 to P2. That's a 5% price increase. And we can have a look at the effect on quantity supplied, the change in quantity supplied. So in this case, a price increase from P1 to P2 of 5% led to an increase in quantity supplied from Q1 to Q2, 15%. So this would be relatively elastic supply. The change in quantity supplied is greater than the change in price, proportionally greater. Here we have a funny looking supply curve, a more normal looking supply curve, and a relatively flat supply curve. PES values vary along the length of the supply curve, just like price elasticity of demand vary along the length of the demand curve. Therefore, it's only possible to make PES comparisons at a point where two or more supply curves intersect. At that point of intersection, it is the flatter supply curve that is more price elastic at that particular price. So S1, perfectly inelastic supply. The quantity supplied is not going to change in response to an increase in price. It won't change at all. The quantity supplied will remain the same. Inelastic supply, we have S2 to demonstrate this. So an increase in price leads to a proportionally less change in quantity supplied, 10% increase in price, only a 5% increase in quantity supplied. And S3 is our elastic supply curve. So a 10% increase will lead to more than proportional change in quantity supplied, 20%. Okay, calculating PES. Now again, we're after percentages here. And our formula is percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. So that's Q over P. Exam mnemonic works again. The queen is above the prince. Quantity is the top line. Price is the bottom line. Example calculation. Price of good A decreases by 10%. Quantity supplied follows in that same direction, decreasing by 12.5%. So in our calculation, that's 12.5 divided by 10, and that turns out to be 1.25. That is our PES coefficient, 1.25, and that's okay. And if the exam question just presents us with numeric information, then we need to go away and find those percentages to be able to use our formula here. Here's the example. Price of good A decreases from $10 to $9, and the quantity supplied decreases from 1,000 units to 875. We work out percentage change in price. So we've got the formula original minus new divided by the original. In this case, $10 was the original price, $9 was the new price, and we divide that by the original price. Multiply it by 100 because we're looking at percentages here, and that turns out to be 10%. And then we follow a change in quantity supplied. We used to the quantity supplied used to be 1,000 units. It changed to 875 with the decrease in price. And the original there was 1,000. So original minus new divided by the original. Multiply by 100 and we get 12.5. Price elasticity of supply, 12.5 divided by 10. Our PES coefficient, 1.25. And just like price elasticity of demand, positive signaling and increase and negative signaling and decrease are not important here. We can forget about them. Not important, the calculations. That's because the relationship between price and quantity supplied is positive, and we'll always end up with a positive number no matter what. Unless we're defying the law of supply. And we wouldn't want to be doing that. Okay, so what do these coefficients mean once we've gone away and calculated them? So if PES is less than 1, this is inelastic supply. So change in quantity supplied is relatively unresponsive to changes in price. So if the price increases by 10%, then quantity supplied will increase by less than that. Elastic supply is any coefficient that we calculate greater than 1. A change in quantity supplied is relatively responsive to changes in price. So the quantity supplied will increase by more than the price increase. Okay, the supply curve cuts the horizontal quantity axis with price in elastic supply. The change in quantity supplied is proportionally smaller than the change in price, and here supply is relatively unresponsive to price. And this shows an example of a price increase of 10% will only increase the quantity supplied by 5%. Or a price decrease of 15% will only decrease the quantity supplied by 10%. In elastic supply, that supply curve cuts the horizontal, the quantity supplied axis. Elastic supply, The supply curve cuts the vertical price axis. With price elastic supply, the change in quantity supply is proportionally larger than the change in price. Supply is relatively responsive to price. So, for example, a price increase of 10% will increase the quantity supplied by 20%, or a price decrease of 15% will decrease the quantity supplied by 25%. So the quantity supplied is going to change by greater than the change in price. Cuts the vertical price axis, elastic supply. A few special cases to consider. When PES equals 1, that's unit elastic supply. The change in quantity supplied is exactly proportional to changes in price. Price increases by 10%, quantity supplied would increase by 10%, for example. And we know we're looking at unit elastic supply for any supply curve that passes through the origin. So where the price axis meets the quantity supplied axis, that's 0. Any supply curve intersecting with that point, we have unit elastic supply. So the supply curve cuts the origin, where price and quantity equals 0. With unit price elastic supply, the change in quantity supplied is equal to the change in price. Supply is responsive to price. For example, a price increase of 10% will increase quantity supplied by 10%. A price decrease of 15% will decrease the quantity supplied by 15%. Now, an example could be a bakery where related products are easily substituted in the production process. So if the price of apple pies increases and become relatively more profitable, the supply of apple pies can easily be increased by baking more apple pies and fewer of the now relatively less profitable blueberry pies. PES equals 0, perfectly inelastic supply. Quantity supplied will not change in response to changes in price. So, for example, if the price increases by 10%, the firm does not have the capacity, the ability to change its quantity supplied. We're looking at a vertical supply curve, and a percentage change in quantity supplied is always 0. Supply is completely unresponsive to price, and for example here, price increase of 10% won't affect the quantity supplied to the market, neither too would a price decrease. Perfectly inelastic supply is importantly a short-term phenomenon. For example, the supply of quickly perishable goods such as seasonal fruit, in this case consider watermelons. Watermelons are too heavy to import and too large to store in refrigerated warehouses. It takes growers time to increase the size of the watermelon crop in response to price changes, and it does not make financial sense to dump the crop once it's ready for market. So receiving $1 a kg is better than receiving $0 for the existing watermelon crop. Supply of watermelons is unchanged in the short term, perfectly inelastic. PES is infinite, perfectly elastic supply. Quantity supplied is infinitely responsive to changes in price. So let's say a price decreases by 10%, quantity supplied is going to fall away to nothing. Quantity supplied will become 0. In completely horizontal supply curve here, percentage change in quantity supplied is infinite. An example, a very small price increase will lead to a very large increase in the quantity supplied. Now the key for perfectly elastic supply is that the good has a large number of very, very, very close, as in perfect, substitutes in production readily available. Any quantity of the good can be produced at the same production cost and price because the productive resources can be easily, as in perfectly, switched back and forth between other goods. This makes an elastic supply curve, a perfectly elastic supply curve, infinitely responsive to changes in price. PES and changes in demand. An example here, prices increased by 10%. Pens is a good. Where supply meets demand, we have our initial equilibrium, giving us initial equilibrium price of P1 and equilibrium quantity of Q1. An increase in demand, this is a change in demand we're looking at. Demand curve shifts to the right, increase in price, increase in quantity demanded and supplied. Price elastic supply, a more than proportional change in quantity supplied as the price changes. So that quantity supplied is increased by more than the change in price. Rice, inelastic supply, we can tell that because the supply curve is intersecting with the horizontal axis there. The same increase in demand produces a large increase in price and a relatively small change in quantity supply. So price and elastic supply, a less than proportional change in quantity supplied as price changes. So this is supply interacting with the demand curve, and how elastic the supply curve will cause the price change, the relative price change. So relatively elastic supply will cause a relatively small price change. Relatively inelastic supply will cause a relatively large price change, but a relatively small change in quantity supplied. Okay, so the value of PS is going to provide important information as to how much of the quantity supplied of a good will change in response to increases or decreases in price caused by changes in demand. Okay, now this is important. What determines whether a good or service is price elastic or price inelastic? We have a few different reasons. Most importantly is the length of time. In the short term, firms may be unable to change the factor inputs it uses in the production process to change the quantity of a good that it produces. Over time, it has more time to adjust and hire more labour, build new factories. So back to our watermelon example. Watermelons are too heavy to import, too large to store. It takes growers time to increase the size of the watermelon crop in response to price changes. It doesn't make any financial sense to dump the crop once it's ready for market. It's better to get $1 than to get nothing. Supply of watermelons is relatively unchanged in the short term. But over time, in the long term, the supply of watermelons can be increased relatively easily. So in response to price increases, farmers are going to convert more farmland into watermelon production. So perhaps replacing a planned sweet corn crop with an additional watermelon crop. They can purchase new farmland to grow watermelons, hire and train extra labour in the long term, and invest in new capital goods and machinery to help produce the increased crop. So over time, the watermelon supply curve will move from S1 to S2 and then to S3. The key point here is that over time, the ability of firms to respond to price changes becomes much greater because they have time to adjust their factor inputs, which is why the supply curve becomes more and more elastic as time goes on. Another important one, mobility of the factors of production. So to be able to increase output, firms must be able to obtain more resources to use in the production of it. The more easily and quickly resources can be shifted from the production of one good to the other, the faster firms can increase or decrease supply. So for example, when unemployment in an economy is high and there's an excess of skilled labour which firms can immediately use in their production process, but when unemployment is low, skilled workers are hard to come by and firms must invest time, money in recruiting, training and developing extra employees required to increase production. Here, labour laws may be variable in determining how price elastic the supply of a good may be. If it is quick, easy and relatively inexpensive for firms to terminate employment contracts, such as in the United States, then firms can reduce output more easily than when labour laws make sacking workers a lengthy and costly process. Example, Italy. Often firms will be running multiple production lines to produce a range of different goods. If this is the case, it may be relatively easy to quickly shift resources, such as labour, out of one line of production and into another. The price of that good increases. Take, for example, Procter & Gamble, the world's largest consumer goods company. They produce different brands of shampoo, and they will use the same factories to do so. So if the price of a premium brand shampoo increases, resources from other lines of less profitable shampoos can be used to meet the additional output required to maximize the firm's total revenues and or total profitability. If firms have spare capacity, a firm will be operating at full capacity when all a firm's capital and labour are being used. So there's no idle plant, there's no idle equipment, and all staff are fully employed. When firms are operating at full capacity, then they will have relatively price inelastic supply. So to increase production, additional capital investment will be required and additional labour must be recruited, trained for the expanded production lines. This takes time and costs the firm money. It will take a relatively large price to substantially increase output. But firms operating with excess capacity will have relatively price elastic demand. Relatively price elastic supply. Output can be increased using the same factors of production, and the firm will be more responsive to increases in price of a good it produces. Relatively small increases in price can be met quickly with additional output up to the point where the firm then begins operating at full capacity again. If there's a capacity shortage, then firms will need significant time to invest in the capital expansion of the business, and additional human capital will then be required. Firms' ability to store stocks is the fourth and final determinant of PED we're interested in. Stocks are goods and components that are held in storage. As stocks of raw materials and finished products are at a high level, then a firm may be able to respond to a change in demand and supply will be elastic. Conversely, when stocks are low, dwindling supplies force prices higher because of scarcity. Okay, so 4 important determinants of price elasticity of supply. An application of price elasticity of supply. Let's have a look at primary and manufactured goods. Take, for example, an increase in price of 10% for a manufactured goods, pens. Relatively small increase in price, relatively large increase in quantity supply. Manufactured goods have price elastic supply, a more than proportional change in quantity supplied as price changes. Whereas for primary goods and commodities, such as rice, where the supply is relatively inelastic, a change in demand is going to increase the price of these primary commodities by a large degree, but change in the quantity supplied will not be as responsive. So the price change will be larger than the quantity supplied. Primary commodities have price inelastic supply, thus a less than proportional change in quantity supplied as price changes. And this provides us with important information as to how much of the quantity supplied of a good will change in response to increases or decreases in price caused by changes in. Taking this primary versus manufactured goods a little bit further, same example, prices are increasing by 10%. We have a manufactured good here, pens, the market for pens. The initial equilibrium, increase in demand, increase in price, an additional increase in demand, an additional increase in price. So manufactured good had price elastic supply, relatively small prices change as demand changes. Not so for our primary goods. Again, the example is rice. Inelastic supply. Now each successive increase in demand is going to lead to a large price change. So because supply is inelastic, it can't be changed relatively easily. These primary commodities have price inelastic supply. This drives up prices as demand changes. And conversely, if demand decreases, prices fall really quickly. So regarding supply, primary commodity products are more price inelastic and manufactured goods are more price elastic, which is due in large part because of the time required for primary producers to respond to price changes. Remember, length of time being one of those primary drivers, primary determinants of how elastic the supply curve is. So for example, agricultural goods such as corn and soybeans require a lesser growing season to increase the supply of a particular crop. So if the price of corn increases as demand increases, it takes at least a year before farmers can produce the extra output needed to meet that increased demand, eliminating the temporary shortage in the market. Often there's also limited land available for increased agricultural use and a limited supply of labour with increasing urbanisation around the world. Many countries are now highly aware of environmental degradation that often occurs with the expansion of farmland. Take, for example, rainforests being cleared in Indonesia to increase the production of palm oil, and rivers in New Zealand being polluted through dairy farm runoff, our dirty cows. Many countries will have increasingly strict rules and regulations around agricultural production. It's going to take time and money to develop the irrigation infrastructure, canals and piping, and capital investment in the machinery and software required to deliver efficient irrigation. If land availability is increasingly scarce, new technologies are required to increase crop yields, and the development of new agricultural technologies, such as genetic modification of rice strains, takes time. Other primary commodities, such as oil, gas, and minerals, things like copper and iron ore, requires much time to explore and develop new fields, develop new mines. And because of the huge costs involved, firms in these industries will not respond quickly to price increases, and it will take a sustained increase in prices for new investment that increase output to take place.